Objection.
Mr. President, I rise today as the senior senator from Louisiana, but I was not born a senator. I was born a Louisianian. I'm a daughter of the Crescent City, raised by a family of places whose names may seem strange and exotic to people in Washington, D.C. and around the nation. Places like Plaquemine, Cocodrie, Kenner, Slidell, St. Tammany, St. Bernard, and Bogalusa. Most people refer to this region of the country, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama, as the Energy Coast, the Maritime Coast, the Gulf Coast. The largest city in this area is the city of New Orleans. Almost 500,000 people, my hometown. At one time or another, every member of this body has told me their own story about what they love about New Orleans and South Louisiana. For some, it's our music. For others, it's Mardi Gras. And yet others, it's that special magic. Each one of you has come away from our state with a special memory, a singular moment that reflects the vibrant culture and personality of our state. And what all of my colleagues have mentioned to me over many years is the special, special spirit of the people. Today, as I stand before my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans, to report to the Senate that our people are hurting, some are despairing, and many are still crying, but our spirit is strong. And it will be this spirit, with the best work the Senate has ever done, that will lift this region and rebuild it. Mr. President, thousands are dead, and only God knows how many. Hundreds and thousands are homeless, jobless, and without their businesses, large and small. But amidst all of this death and destruction and water and anguish and anger, our spirit is strong, and there are thousands of heroes. Those heroes, Mr. President, may not be anybody in this chamber, but I'll tell you who the heroes are. They are the leaders of Plaquemine Parish and St. Bernard and Orleans and Jefferson and the counties in Mississippi that kept their local governments functioning even as much of their parish lay underwater. In St. Bernard and Plaquemine Parish, that water was 8 to 20 feet high. And in the city of New Orleans, that now has virtually no one in it, the water still stands on the east bank underwater anywhere from 6 to 10 feet. The only thing out of the water the last time I left was Jackson Square, the cathedral, and the French Quarter, because the people who settled the city were smart enough to put it on the highest ground they could find. And that high ground has been serving this nation so well and so magnificently for over 300 years. And it's still there. There's not a drop of water on Jackson Square. In New Orleans, sheriffs secured and evacuated the city jail, not because they were trying to coddle the prisoners, but because there was a threatened jailbreak when the system failed and the electricity went off. So sheriffs who had lost their own homes and had lost maybe members of their own family swam through water to get the prisoners out of the prison, not to give them a warm meal, but to secure them so hardened rapists and murderers would not plague the city at its time of greatest distress. In Chalmette, when my elected officials looked out of their window, because I heard them on the speakerphone asking me and asking the governor to come evacuate them because their building was collapsing, we told them we couldn't evacuate them at that moment, but we would get them out as soon as we could. When they looked out of their window, Mr. President, all they could see was water. 8 to 6 feet deep, not in anything you could walk through or drive through. You either swam or you had a boat. I'm sorry, they just didn't at that moment have enough boats. Our local leaders never once flinched from their duty to protect their residents and save every man, woman, or child, regardless of race or income level. It was so desperate that the law enforcement didn't have to triage. The people were triaging themselves. In other words, when the boat drove up, they would put the old people first in the boat, then they would put the babies in the boat, and all the young, halfway healthy people would just stay on the roof until the boat could come back. I flew back here after one plane that I got on had no fuel. I had to come back with the commander of the Coast Guard, and he told me himself yesterday the Coast Guard itself rescued 32,000 people, either in boats or by helicopter. That's not counting what the wildlife and fisheries did in Louisiana or Mississippi or Alabama. That's not counting what regular boat owners, once they could wade through water and turn their engines and their boats on, went down and did themselves, of which the news media did not cover, because the only thing the news media could focus on was the convention center and the Superdome, because it made the best picture. We understand that as politicians. They need visuals. So I'm sorry I couldn't provide any more visuals for them, but there was a lot more going on than just to the Superdome and the convention center. And across the state, perhaps the greatest heroes are those we don't know about, the concerned friends who looked on an elderly neighbor and ensured their safe evacuation. One brief story. An elderly African-American woman in a shelter came up to me, strong. She was a retired teacher. Her feet were wrapped because she had cut up her feet in this episode. She said, "Miss Landrieu, please go back and tell those people in Washington, we were fine after the hurricane hit. It wasn't the hurricane that put us under. That water came from that levee. Don't they know anything up there about the 17th Street Canal? Don't they know anything about the Florida Street Canal?" I said, "No, ma'am, but we're going to tell them a little bit more about that." She said, "I stood on my ladder for 2 days. She said, "I've never seen water like that. That water kept coming up 6 inches and going down 6 inches." You know what that woman was experiencing? The tide in Lake Pontchartrain. She said, "I've never seen flood water like that. It kept coming up to my nose and going down to my chest." Mr. President, the Louisiana state flag depicts a pelican. The pelican takes from herself, her own breast, to feed her young. Thousands of Louisianians this week brought that state symbol to life. But as brave and bold as my fellow Louisianians have been, and our heart goes out to our friends in Mississippi, we have also been moved beyond measure by the generosity and selflessness of our fellow Americans. New York City itself has sent 600 of its finest and bravest police officers and firefighters who are willing to run into a collapsing tower on September 11th, knowing what we didn't know, knowing that the radios on their hips were not going to work, and they ran in the building anyway. Those police officers are on their way right now to help the city of New Orleans, and I want to thank the senators from New York, the delegation from New York, for sending them. Cities, suburbs, and states across the nation have welcomed our citizens as their own. Senator Lincoln told me yesterday on the phone, and I've talked to many of my colleagues, she said, "Mary, just send them north. As soon as they cross the border, I got them in my arms." And I thank Senator Lincoln, and I thank all the senators that have called. And so if it's possible that my heart is a little heavy today, I've seen more in the last 2 weeks than I've seen in my entire life, and I hope never to witness it again. But while my heart is heavy, my spirit is also lifted as I've seen countless volunteers, corporations, local elected officials, with little more than just the good sense that God gave them, saving everyone that they could save amidst all of the criticism that they've had to bear from their own government officials. In this chamber alone, every one of you voted the other night to send billions of dollars of aid and assistance. As Harry Reid said earlier today, it will probably cost us a lot more. I'm sorry I cannot report to you even an accurate estimate of what that might be, but I predict it will be over $200 billion. As I stand here today, Senator Vitter, my partner, remains in the state to continue assessing damage. He has been a steady voice through this, and I want to acknowledge him. This unprecedented catastrophe will require unprecedented support. I am concerned today because our nation, our national government, failed in its greatest responsibility, and that is protecting the lives of Americans. I'm not saying the military failed, the Coast Guard failed, and most certainly not the National Guard. That was there before the storm hit and is still there, every member of the National Guard in Louisiana. Let me talk a minute about my National Guard. 8,000 of them have already been to Iraq and back, not once, but twice. 3,000 of them are scheduled to come home in September. The governor and I and Senator Vitter were planning a homecoming for them. They are going to get quite a homecoming because many of them are from South Louisiana and they don't have homes to come home to. Well, let me say this. They don't have houses to come home to, but they do have a home. And we will do the best we can, and General Landrieu is well aware of the situation with his men and women on their way home from Iraq to hold their families tight. We must learn from this experience. If we do not, we will fail again. I've learned more in 2 weeks than I could ever have hoped to learn. I'm going to continue to learn, and I ask the senators to open their hearts and minds and learn. We don't ever want this to happen to any other city or any other place in this country for as long as we're on this earth and beyond. It is not true that Louisiana was not prepared. Surely we could have done a better job, I'm sure, in every case. But our evacuation plan, and I want to give credit to the governor of Mississippi and the governor of Louisiana, Haley Barbour and Kathleen Blanco, who have been planning for over a year since the last disaster of Hurricane Ivan, where everyone got stuck on the interstates and the back roads. Those two governors worked out a plan because we share a highway. We don't have like a Louisiana highway that goes north and a Mississippi highway. We share our highways. And those governors made a plan to get everybody out, and it worked as well as something like that can work. I'll let you all figure out the details. We had 2 million people approximately to evacuate in about 2 days. You all do the math. We got a lot of people out. But when the storm hit and the levees broke, our calls went unanswered. Bills have languished here on the calendar. Money we requested before has been postponed year after year, year after year, year after year. I don't even want to talk to my colleagues about coastal erosion. They've heard it from me so many times and from everybody in the Louisiana delegation. They can give the speech better than I can. But I'll tell you one thing about our federal government. Our federal government, whether it was FEMA or this administration or former administrations or us, gambled that the predictions that countless experts voiced time and time again were mere rhetoric. They gambled that no one would notice if Louisiana's critical and vital role in our national's economy was threatened. And Washington rolled the dice, and Louisiana lost. I cannot stand here today and tell you that if all the money we had asked for, if it would have kept the levees up, but I can tell you that it would have given us more protection than we had. Nor can I say with certainty that full funding for restoring our coast would have protected those who perished in St. Bernard and Plaquemine and St. Tammany, or in Jefferson, Washington Parish, and the counties in Mississippi. But I can assure you that we would have at least had a fighting chance. And I intend to find out just how much of a fighting chance we would have had. And I intend to find out why the federal response, particularly the response of FEMA, was so incompetent and insulting to the people of our states. Already some in Washington, the Washington Post is pointing fingers, not the newspaper, but reported in the newspaper, that something is wrong with my state and local officials. And if they would just been a little smarter, a little tougher, a little braver, that maybe this could have been avoided. This hurricane was a Category 4. It was one of the worst storms we've seen in this century. The eye of the storm went right over Slidell, Louisiana. Waveland is gone, I understand, from Senator Cochran and Senator Lott. Biloxi is quite damaged, and that's where the storm came. I'm sorry we couldn't do anything about that. But I want you to know the people of our states have survived storms before. That was not what put us under. It was the levee systems that broke in New Orleans, a city that invented the gravity pump, a city that helped the Dutch secure the Netherlands and sent our engineering to Venice to keep that city floating. We invented those pumps in South Louisiana. We know about pumps. Harry Reid's seen them himself. We know that the head of the National Hurricane Center said that he briefed the President of the United States on the threat of Katrina in a video conference call the day before she hit land. We know the President said, quote, "I don't think anybody anticipated the breach of the levees." Everybody anticipated the breach of the levees, Mr. President, including computer simulations in which this administration participated. Even the clay figurine, Mr. Bill from Saturday Night Live, anticipated the breach. His creator, a friend of mine, has used him in public service announcements for over 2 years, public servants announcements, saying this will be the effect if this happens. How can it be that Mr. Bill was better informed than Mr. Bush? We know Secretary of Homeland Security pronounced himself, quote, "extremely pleased with the response of every element of the federal government," even as the cable news networks were showing images telling how he was so tragically wrong. We know that FEMA was unaware that 20,000 Americans were stranded at the convention center without food, without water, without security, without clothes, without buses, without toilets, and with no way out. And I had to stand there and listen to the news media say these people were lawless. These were mothers and fathers trying to find water for their kids. I might have been a little upset under the circumstances myself. We know, Mr. President, that someone has to be accountable. Let me be the first to take any blame that is to be blamed. I will not allow my local officials, my governor, my lieutenant governor, who happens to be my brother, who spent 3 days in a rescue boat despite the pleas of his own wife, his sister, his mother, and father not to go. He went anyway, and he lifted the dead and alive out with his own hands. With 24 hours of the storm hitting the Gulf Coast, Senator Frist called and Senator Reid called, and I appreciate so much. They were right there. I tried to reach Thad Cochran. He tried to reach me. I tried to reach Trent Lott. He tried to reach me, and David Vitter and I were together the whole time. But we couldn't get through on our cell phones. I know they called, and I thank them very much. The record for rebuilding will be staggering, but it will pale in comparison to the staggering incompetence of this national government who is responsible. I'm going to submit a lot to the record because I don't want to keep my colleagues here much longer, but I want to say something about this to the nation. Black people suffered, white people suffered, poor people suffered, and rich people suffered. The whole city is underwater on the East Bank. The wealthy neighborhoods have 10 feet of water, and the poor neighborhoods have 10 feet of water. Water does not know boundaries. It doesn't know demographics. It doesn't know Democrat or Republican. It doesn't know to stop at rich neighborhoods. It doesn't know just to go to poor neighborhoods. It goes everywhere. And there are wealthy people who are desperate. They don't know how to set up their businesses and keep their employees paid. They have no idea where to put their businesses. Do they leave the state? Do they go to Atlanta? Do they come back? What do they do with their wife and children? Do they take them and put them in school in Atlanta, or do they set their businesses up on the highest ground they can find? Poor people are very disoriented. They have a hard time anyway. They're having a real hard time now. And I want to say a special word of thanks personally to Ted Koppel for the beautiful piece that he did last night, because I haven't been able to watch much television myself, but I got to see his piece. And we need journalists like that. I kept thinking, where's Walter Cronkite? And all I had was Geraldo Rivera. I'm going to submit the rest of this for the record, but I want to personally thank my family, my parents, my children who evacuated with me that morning, and we evacuated ourselves. And the final word is this to the President. Mr. President, we need you. We need your help. When the last time I shook the President's hand, he looked at me and he said, "Senator, I appreciate your passion." And I said, "Thank you, Mr. President, because passion is what we need." He said, "I'm sorry you lost your childhood home. I know that's upsetting to you." I want to be clear for the record in that piece that you all saw with me with George Stephanopoulos. I was not crying an anguished cry because the home that I walked out of with my children was gone. I knew it would be gone when I left. It was an anguished cry of plea to the only person that I thought could hear, and that was God himself. And I think he has heard, because the people of my state have cried out to him for now over a week and a half. But as he gives us the grace and the wisdom to do our job, I hope we can do it well, because there are thousands and hundreds of thousands, thousands of people and hundreds of thousands of families that are depending on us to do our best work. Today we're going to rebuild New Orleans and the Gulf Coast and the coast of Mississippi. It is an energy coast. It was put there for a reason. We did not go there to sunbathe. We went there to set up the Mississippi River, to tame that river, to create channels for this country to grow and prosper. The Higgins boats that saved us from World War II were built in New Orleans. 43,000 people built those boats and headed them out to Normandy. We're going to rebuild our shipping industry, we're going to rebuild our maritime industry, and we are going to rebuild this great Gulf Coast of the United States, and I'll submit the rest to the record. Thank you.
Without objection. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.